This is the second of our two-part series on contract performance. Here we're going to talk about performing contracts dealing with the sale of goods. What are the rules that are specific to a buyer's and seller's obligations with respect to their duties under a sale of goods contract? Now, in part one, we talked about common law contract performance. In this part, we're going to talk about contract performance under UCC Article 2, which you'll remember deals with the sale of goods. So UCC Article 2 imposes some specific duties of performance on sellers and buyers of goods. Now, the common law performance rules still usually apply, but Article 2 sort of supplements those rules with some specific rules targeted at sellers and buyers of goods. So let's take sellers first. If you're a seller, what are your performance obligations? Now, your main duty as the seller of goods is to what we call make tender of delivery. What this means is, as the seller, your job is to complete your delivery obligations, whatever those are. It might be handing the goods over to a common carrier like the post office or UPS or whatever. It might be actually physically delivering the goods to the buyer. It might be just holding them for the buyer to come and pick up. Whatever your delivery obligations are, tender of delivery means your job is to fulfill those obligations as called for in the contract. Now, the UCC Article 2 imposes what's called the perfect tender rule. The perfect tender rule means, as a seller of goods, your job is to deliver the exact goods called for by the contract. So, for instance, suppose you have a contract with a bicycle manufacturer to purchase 100 blue bikes. You own a little bike shop, you want to sell blue bikes in your bike shop. You contact the manufacturer, say, I want to buy 100 blue bikes. The perfect tender rule requires the manufacturer to ship you 100 blue bikes, not 99 blue bikes, not 50 blue bikes and 50 red bikes, but 100 blue bikes. That's the perfect tender rule. If they give you anything else, that's a breach of contract. Now, say they give you 50 blue bikes and 50 red bikes. Those red bikes are what we call non-conforming goods. They violate the perfect tender rule. They're not what you ordered. They are non-conforming. Now, if a seller provides non-conforming goods, they actually have the opportunity to cure. So maybe it was an accident. Maybe they sent you 99 blue bikes and one red bike, and you call them up and say, hey, you sent me non-conforming goods, this one red bike. They might say, oops, we just put the wrong thing in the package. We'll send you a new blue bike, and we'll come pick up the red bike. Sellers have the opportunity to cure when they sell you non-conforming goods. Now, as the buyer, if the seller sends non-conforming goods, you actually have three options. Option number one is to reject the entire shipment. Option number two is to accept the entire shipment. So maybe you order 100 blue bikes, you get the 100 red bikes, and you think, gee whiz, these are great bikes. I'm just going to keep the 100 red bikes. You can do that. Option number three is you can actually accept part of the shipment and reject part of it. So say you have a bike shop and you have customers that are chomping at the bit for your bikes, and you say, all I got is red bikes, but I gotta have some bikes to sell, so I'll keep 20 of these red bikes because I need to be able to sell them to my customers, but I'll reject the other 80 red bikes because I really wanted blue bikes. You can do that. Okay, the perfect tender rule actually has a few exceptions. So exception number one, if goods are damaged or destroyed through no fault of the seller, so the bike company ships you the bikes, and while they're in the hands of the shipping company, they're swept away by a tornado. That's not the seller's fault. In that case, the contract is actually voided. So all parties are relieved from their obligations. Second exception, in the case of installment contracts, each installment is treated separately with regards to the perfect tender rule. So for instance, say you have a contract to ship a customer 1,000 widgets a month for the next year. Every single widget shipment is its own separate entity for purposes of the perfect tender rule. So say shipment number 6 has the wrong type of widgets in it. The customer can't terminate the entire contract because one shipment was incorrect. They can reject that shipment if it has non-conforming goods, but if shipments 1 through 5 were correct, they can't just say, we're terminating this whole contract because shipment 6 was incorrect. And then the third exception to the perfect tender rule is that if your industry has some sort of industry norm that allows a degree of variance or a degree of nonconformity in the goods, then that's an exception to the perfect tender rule. So going back to our example of the bikes. Say in the bicycle manufacturing industry, it's just commonly known that if you order blue bikes and they ship you blue bikes or seafoam colored bikes or teal bikes or whatever other colors that are sort of close to blue, that's generally accepted in the industry. Well, that's an exception to the perfect tender rule. Okay, let's talk about buyer performance obligations. Buyer really has three obligations. First, inspect the goods, and then accept or reject the goods and pay for the goods. So acceptance or rejection should be done within a reasonable time. You can't call up the seller of goods a year later and say, oh, by the way, you sent me non-conforming goods. You've got to inspect the goods and accept or reject them in a reasonable time. And then your duty to pay actually doesn't arise until you verify, yes, these are conforming goods. Because until you have conforming goods, you don't have any duty to pay. Now, this actually gives rise to sort of an interesting twist in the sale of goods scenarios. Sometimes your duty to pay will not arise until before or after the actual payment has been made. So let's consider this example. You have a contract for the sale of goods that calls for payment to be made at the time you place the order. This is pretty common, right? You ever bought anything online? Payment is always made at the time you place the order. So your contract calls for payment to be made at the time of the order. But your actual duty to pay has not arisen at that time. Remember, your duty to pay doesn't arise until you confirm that you got conforming goods. So the shipper ships you the goods, you inspect them, you say, these are conforming, then your duty to pay arises. But if you get the goods, they're non-conforming, your duty to pay has never arisen. So even though you may have already actually made the payment, your duty to pay hasn't arisen, so the seller could be forced to refund you the payment for non-conforming goods because your duty to pay never arises. Just sort of an interesting quirk. Next time you make an online order, know that even though you may have made payment, you might not have had the duty to pay just yet.